There are stories that begin at the edge of things, at the edge of a road, the edge of a season, the edge of a life worn down to its last thread. This is one of those stories. It begins with a healer's apprentice named Marin, green-eyed and gray-skinned and tusked at the jaw, pulling her two small children through a snowstorm on a borrowed sled, with nothing behind her worth returning to and nothing ahead of her she could yet name. And it ends, as the truest stories do, with a voice reclaimed, a fire shared, and the quiet understanding that some losses make room for what they leave behind. But we start in the cold. By the way, wherever in the world you're listening from right now, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Okay, where were we? The storm had been building since mid-morning. Marin had watched it gather over the Greyvale Ridge the way debt gathers, slowly, then all at once. She had left the settlement of Carath Ford at dawn, before anyone with authority over her could think to stop her. With her daughter Selah pressed against her left side, and her son Bryn asleep across the sled's planking, bundled so thoroughly that only the dark oval of his face showed above the wool. Selah was 7. Bryn was 4. Marin herself had just turned 29, though she looked older in the way that women look older when they have been spending their reserves for years without anyone noticing the cost. She had been a healer's apprentice in Carath Ford, apprenticed to a man named Dovar, who had long since stopped being her teacher and started being her keeper. Dovar was an orc, like Marin, and that mattered in Carath Ford in ways both obvious and subtle. The town sat at the meeting of 3 human trade roads. It had a council of 7, all human. It had a constable who was polite and unhelpful in equal measure. And it had an old, unwritten understanding that orc settlers were welcome to labor and not much else. Dovar had used that understanding the way a mason uses a chisel, to cut and shape and contain. He had told Marin steadily over 6 years that she was lucky to have his protection, that without him, the town would not shelter her or her children, that her own kind of knowing, the root medicines, the wound reading she had learned from her mother before her mother died, was only valuable because he let it be called healing rather than something uglier. She had believed him for longer than she should have. Most people believe the person who controls their circumstances for longer than they should. It is not weakness, it is how containment works. What finally broke it was not a single event. It was a morning in early winter when Bryn, running a fever of 3 days standing, had reached for her hand in the night and said, in the small, exhausted voice of a 4-year-old who has been awake too long, "Are we staying here always, Mama?" And Marin had looked at the room, the narrow room Dover's generosity had given them with its single window and the lock on the outside of the door, and understood that always was the only answer the room was built to produce. She packed what she could carry in 2 sacks and 1 sled. She left before the light. The storm found her 11 miles out of Carath Ford, on the Greyvale Road, in the shallow pass between 2 ridges where the wind had nowhere to go but through. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in the time it took her to pull the sled from one tree line to the next. Selah stopped complaining about the cold and started walking with her head down, which was worse. Bryn woke and asked for water. Marin gave him the last of the flask and watched the tree line on the right for any break, any roof line, any chimney smoke. There was nothing for a long time. Then there was a gate. It was a simple gate, split timber set between two stone posts with a lantern hung on the right-hand post that was somehow still lit despite the wind. The lantern burned amber. Behind the gate, a path cut through snow-loaded pines toward a dark shape that resolved, as Maren blinked ice from her lashes, into a long house of rough-hewn stone with a roof weighted down in white and a thread of smoke rising from its central chimney. She stood at the gate for a moment. Bryn had stopped asking questions. Selah had pressed herself against Maren's leg and was holding very still in the particular way children hold still when they are frightened and trying not to show it. Maren pushed the gate open. She had gone perhaps 30 feet up the path when the door of the longhouse opened and a man stepped out. He was human, broad through the shoulders, somewhere in his middle 40s, wearing a heavy canvas work coat and carrying an axe that he immediately lowered to his side when he saw her. He had a weathered face, dark brows, and a look that was not hostile but was not yet warm. The look of a man who had been alone long enough that he had to think about how faces worked before arranging his own into an expression. His name was Aldrich. She did not know that yet. She knew only that he had lowered the axe and was walking toward her through the snow with the slow, non-threatening deliberateness of someone who had either learned or decided that quick movements were no good in uncertain moments. He stopped 6 feet from her. He looked at the sled, at Bryn's bundled shape, at Selah's face, at Maren's jaw where the cold had turned her gray skin almost blue. He said, "Come in then." That was all. No qualifications. No visible calculation. Come in then, as though she had knocked at his door in fine weather and he had answered, and this was simply the next natural thing. Maren said, "We cannot pay for lodging tonight." He said, "I didn't ask." She said, "My children are half frozen." He said, "Yes, I can see that," which was the plainest possible statement of the plainest possible fact, and he said it without heat or judgment, and something in the way he said it, something in the just seeing of her actual situation, without augmenting it or diminishing it, made her eyes sting in a way the cold had not quite managed. She pulled the sled the remaining distance to the door. The inside of the longhouse was warm in the way that only a place that has been tended for many years can be warm. A warmth that had settled into the walls and the floor and the wood of the furniture. A warmth that existed because someone had consistently maintained it, rather than because someone had piled on fuel in a panic. The central hearth was well laid, burning hardwood, with an iron pot hung above it that smelled of stock and dried herbs. The floor was swept stone. The walls held shelves of neatly labeled clay jars, bundled dried things, tools hung in order of size. A pair of work boots sat beside the door, placed just so. Everything in the room said, "Someone lives here deliberately." Maren noticed something else. On the mantel above the hearth, set between two iron candle holders, was a small carved figure. A woman, perhaps 8 inches tall, worked in pale birchwood, her arms slightly lifted, her face worn smooth from handling. Around her neck, someone had tied a thin cord hung with dried flowers, so old they had gone nearly colorless. The figure had not been dusted in some time, but it had not been moved either. It stood in the center of things the way a fixed point stands. Not decoration, not storage, but a kind of permanent address. Aldrich did not look at it. He was already crouching by the fire, adding a log, shaking out a heavy wool blanket from the chest beside the hearth. He handed the blanket to Maren without ceremony and went to the pot and ladled stock into 2 clay cups, small cups, just the right size for children's hands, and brought them to Selah and Bryn. Sella looked at the cup and then looked at Aldrich for a long time with the measuring, unchildlike gaze of a 7-year-old who has learned to read the adults near her for signs of safety. She took the cup. Bryn said, "Thank you," and drank half of his in one long pull, and then said, "It's really good," with the complete and devastating honesty of a 4-year-old. And Aldrich said, "Good," quietly, and something in his face shifted very slightly, like a door not opening, but considering it. Maren stood near the fire and felt the warmth moving through her layers and into her skin, and she kept waiting for the rest of it, for the conditions to appear, for the calculation to surface, for the voice that said nothing is given freely, and you will owe for this. The voice had been with her for 6 years. It did not quiet easily, but Aldrich only moved around his house, doing the things that needed doing, hanging her wet outer coat by the fire, spreading a second blanket on the pallet near the hearth for the children, checking the pot. And he asked her nothing except, once, "Is the boy fevered? Because his color is high." Maren said, "He was 3 days ago. I think it's passing." Aldrich said, "There's willow bark in the jar marked W on the 3rd shelf, if it returns." She looked at the jars. She looked at him. He said, "My wife kept the remedies. I've maintained the labels. I don't always know what's what, but the labels are honest." He said it plainly, not inviting discussion, not closing it off. He said it the way a man states something true that he has made his peace with stating. And then he went back to tending the fire. Maren found the jar marked W and held it and felt the dried bark inside through the clay, and for the first time in 11 miles, she breathed without counting the breath. She stayed the night. She meant to leave in the morning. The morning brought 2 feet of new snow, and a wind that drove ice sideways across the windows, and leaving was not possible, and Aldrich said nothing about this, and moved his morning routine to accommodate 3 additional people with the quiet efficiency of a man who had once kept a full household and had not entirely forgotten how. She stayed 3 days. The storm required it. On the 4th morning, the sky cleared to a pale, hard blue, and the road was technically passable, and Maren stood in the doorway with her coat on and her bags packed, the children fed, the sled ready. Aldrich was at the woodpile, splitting logs. He did not look up for a moment. Then he set the axe down and turned. He said, "There's work, if you need it. The physics stores need organizing. I've been meaning to do it for 2 winters, and I haven't. I've a root cellar that needs the same. I can't offer much in the way of coin, but there's room here and food enough," Maren said. "I don't need charity," Aldrich said. "I said work. I need the stores organized, and I don't know the remedies well enough to do it myself. You do. That's an exchange." She stood with her bags in her hands and the clear winter light sharp on the snow around her, and she thought, this could be another kind of trap. She had thought that before. She had been right before. She turned the offer over in her mind the way you turn a stone, looking for the place where it was hollow. But the thing was, she was a healer's apprentice with nowhere to go, and 2 children, and the nearest town of any size was 40 miles east on a road that would not clear until late spring. And the physics stores did need organizing. She had seen it, the jars half catalogued, the dried things mixed in with each other, the bundles unlabeled. She would have organized them for free, honestly, because disorder in a medicine store is its own kind of danger. And the man had not asked a single thing of her that was not plain and reasonable, and his house had fed her children and warmed them, and the willow bark was exactly where he said it would be. She put her bags down. She said, "I'll need to know what system your wife used, whether she organized by function or by plant." Aldrich said, "By plant, I think. She had a practical mind." Maren said, "So do I." She unpacked her bags. What followed was not a grand arrangement. It was not love at first glance or transformation overnight. It was a winter, and winter is long and specific. And what happened the way things happen when two people share daily work in a finite space. Gradually, and then undeniably, and with a texture of detail that is more convincing than any dramatic declaration. The physics stores took her 4 days to organize, and another 2 to document on the blank pages of an old ledger Aldrich found in the desk. Maren worked with the precision she had learned from her mother, laying each root and bundle on the long work table, smelling it, examining it, recording its name and use and approximate quantity. She found things she recognized from her own training: bone set and woundwort, feverfew and lung moss, and things she did not recognize at all, which she set aside in a separate row and labeled with a question mark and asked Aldrich about in the evenings. Aldrich knew more than he'd said. He had watched his wife work for 19 years, and he had not been taught, but he had been present, which is a different kind of knowing. He could identify most things by smell. He described their uses haltingly, the way a person describes a language they learned by immersion rather than instruction. And Maren wrote the descriptions down, and they compared them to what she knew. And sometimes his memory and her training agreed exactly, and those moments produced a particular kind of quiet satisfaction in both of them that neither of them named. Bryn learned the name of the cat. The cat was named Stone, which Bryn found enormously funny and said aloud at minimum 15 times a day for the first week. Stone was large and gray and indifferent to almost everything except the warmth near the hearth and occasional pieces of dried fish. And it took approximately 3 days to decide that Bryn was an acceptable heat source, and took to draping itself across his legs in the evenings, which Bryn bore with the solemn pride of a 4-year-old who has been chosen. Sella took longer. Sella watched Aldrich with the careful attention of a child who has been taught by experience to watch adults closely. She watched how he moved around Maren, whether he stepped in front of her or beside her, whether he spoke over her or waited. She watched how he handled the axe when he was working, and whether anything changed in his face or body when plans changed or something went wrong. She was conducting, at 7 years old, a systematic evaluation of a grown man's character, and she was doing it with more rigor and patience than most adults apply to the same task. She came to her conclusions in the 3rd week. What she did was this. She brought Aldrich a piece of birchwood she had found in the yard and put it on the table where he was working and said, "Can you make something?" Aldrich looked at the wood. He said, "What would you like?" She said, "A horse or a bird. Either is fine." He made her a bird over the course of 4 evenings, working in the hour after supper when the fire was low and the house was quiet. He worked carefully and without pretension, and when he handed it to her, on the 4th evening Sela turned it over in her hands for a long moment and then said, "The wings aren't even." Aldrich said, "No, they're not." Sela said, "That's all right. Birds' wings aren't always even either." She kept it. She kept it in her coat pocket, and the shape of it gradually softened one wing slightly from the heat of her hand, and eventually the 2 wings were approximately the same, and she seemed to find this correct. Maren saw all of this. She noticed the bird. She noticed that Aldrich did not point it out or make anything of it, which was the right response and also revealed something about what he understood, She noticed that her own body had begun to perform its daily work without the low-level bracing that had accompanied every daily task for years. The preemptive wincing, the constant monitoring of mood and temperature in the room, the rerouting of small decisions through the question of how they would land. She noticed the absence of all that, the way you notice the absence of a chronic pain, first with disbelief, then with caution, then with something tentative that might eventually become ease. One evening in the 7th week, she was measuring out portions of dried lung moss by lamplight, the children asleep behind the curtain Aldrich had rigged for their corner, and she became aware that she had been humming. She stopped. She had not hummed in years. The last time she had hummed while working, she had been in her mother's kitchen at 15, and Dovar's voice had layered itself over the memory so thoroughly that she had not been able to find the original sound beneath it. She sat with the silence for a moment. Then, very quietly, she continued humming. Aldrich was at the other end of the table, reading. He did not look up. He was good at that, at being present without pressing, at occupying the same space without filling it. She thought, not for the first time, that this was a skill a man either had or did not have, and that it could not be performed, only inhabited. It was that evening, after a further silence that had settled into comfort, that she told him. She did not plan to. She had not rehearsed it. She simply found herself saying, "The man I worked for, his name was Dovar. He told me for 6 years that I was lucky." Aldrich set down his book. She said, "He didn't hurt us with his hands. He was careful about that. He used other things. What the town thought of orc settlers. What would happen to my children if I left and he withdrew his vouching? He was very good at making the world look exactly as dangerous as he needed it to look." Aldrich said nothing. He waited. She said, "I think he believed some of it. That makes it harder to explain to people. They say, 'He didn't hit you.' They say, 'You had a roof.'" She paused. "He made the roof a weapon," she said. "He made every kindness a debt." The fire settled. Outside the window the night was clear and absolute, the kind of winter night where the stars are hard as nails in the sky. Aldrich said, "The locks were on the outside." She looked at him. He said, "You told me that your first night here. You mentioned it in passing." He said it quietly, without drama, just, "You told me, and I heard you, and I have been holding it since then." Maren looked at the table. She said, "I got out. Most days that feels like enough." Aldrich said, "It is enough." He said it without adjective or flourish, the way he said most of the things that mattered. She looked at him then, really looked, in the lamp's low light, at this man who had handed her willow bark directions and a wool blanket and 30 feet of non-threatening approach through a snowstorm and 6 weeks of work and space and the particular dignity of being taken at face value. And she thought of her mother's saying, the one she had forgotten under years of Dovar's certainties, "The strongest roots don't grow by reaching. They grow by being given enough room to find their own direction." She had not been given room in a long time. She was beginning to feel the reach of her own roots again, slow and tentative, seeking something solid. That was the 7th week. Dovar came in the 9th. He arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed wrong. Catastrophes should not arrive on Tuesdays in clear winter light with the roads freshly packed and the sky a benign pale gray. They should announce themselves more dramatically. But he arrived on a Tuesday with a hired runner, 2 steps behind him, carrying a document satchel, and he arrived at the gate of Aldrich's property at the hour when Maren was outside, beating the dust from the winter rugs, and Selah was at the side of the house, making a snow construction of ambitious and uncertain architecture. Marin saw him at the gate, and her hands went still on the rug beater. Dovar was 47 years old, broad, well-dressed in heavy Orc merchant's wool, with the kind of composed, pleasant face that public figures cultivate over many years of requiring witnesses. He had made the 40-mile journey from Karath Ford, which meant someone had told him where she was, which meant someone in this valley had sent word, which meant she had been visible longer than she'd thought. He called her name from the gate. He called it warmly, with the particular warmth that is engineered to project, to be heard, to establish the register of the exchange before the exchange has properly begun. Selah had gone entirely still at the corner of the house. Marin said, "Go inside," to Selah, in a voice pitched low and level, and Selah went without argument, which told Marin everything about what Selah's evaluation had concluded, because Selah did not go inside without argument for anyone except people she had decided were worth the deference. Marin walked to the gate. She did not open it. Dovar looked at her with a kind of indulgent patience that was itself a statement of power. He said, "I was worried about you. 11 miles in that storm with the children. You might have told me you were going." She said, "I left before you were awake." He said, "Yes," and smiled faintly at the admission, as if her having timed her departure was evidence of something he was choosing not to name. Not yet, not here, not until the witness situation was clarified. He looked past her at the longhouse. He said, "You found yourself a situation." She said, "I work here." He said, "Yes, I'd heard." He let the pause sit for a moment, expanding. Then he said, "I have papers from the Karath Ford Practitioners' Council, Marin. Your apprenticeship was registered with them." The terms of registered apprenticeship under the Tri-Roads Charter, she would know the charter, he was sure, granted the registered master certain rights of continuation and certain remedies in the case of abandonment. She said, "I wasn't an apprentice by the end. I was a laborer." He said, "The council's papers say otherwise." He nodded toward the runner, who began to unfasten the satchel. This was the moment the longhouse door opened and Aldrich came out. He crossed the yard at an even pace, not rushing, not posturing, and he stood beside Marin at the gate, beside, not in front, and he looked at Dovar with the steady, undemonstrative attention of a man who had been listening through a window and had decided this required his body's presence, even if not, yet, his voice. Dovar looked at Aldrich with the calculating assessment of someone revising his situation in real time. He said, "I don't believe we've met. I'm Dovar, master healer of Karath Ford." Marin's teacher and guardian. Aldrich said, "Aldrich, she works here," Dovar said. "As I understand it." He smiled pleasantly. He said, "I wonder if you understand the legal situation. Under the Tri-Roads Charter, a registered apprentice who abandons placement prior to term completion can be called to account before the council. The master retains right of claim until the term is discharged, or a settlement agreed." He paused. "I'm not here to make trouble. I'm simply here to make sure Marin understands her position." It was a well-constructed speech. It had been crafted to sound reasonable. It used the word simply in the particular way that people use simply when they mean the opposite. It named Marin's position without defining it, leaving it large and ominous and unmapped. Marin said, "My term ended 3 years ago." Dovar said, "We agreed verbally to an extension." She said, "You told me verbally that leaving would ruin my children's standing in the town. That is not an agreement. that is a threat." His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He said, "That's a serious thing to say in front of witnesses." She said, "Yes, I know." The runner with the satchel had gone slightly still. There was a sound on the road then, the crunch of boots on packed snow, and from the direction of the valley came two figures. A woman in a healer's white overcloak who was older than any of them and walked with a staff and a face that suggested she had heard most of the world's arguments and found the majority of them unpersuasive. And beside her, a man of middling years in a council blue coat, carrying a leather folio stamped with an official seal that was not the Careth Ford seal, but was considerably larger. Their names were Physician Oreth, of the Greyvale Valley Healers Compact, and Master Henwick, the regional charter arbiter. Aldrich had sent for them on the 6th day after Marin's arrival, quietly by rider, not saying anything to Marin about it. This was the only thing he had done without telling her, and he would explain it later as, "I thought she should have the choice to tell her own story, but I wanted to make sure there was someone whose job it was to hear it." Physician Oreth looked at Dovar with the particular expression of a woman who has read many documents from Careth Ford in the past several years and found their contents instructive. She said, "Dovar of Careth Ford. The Compact has been interested in your apprenticeship records for some time." She said it without inflection, the way a physician names a symptom, accurately and without editorial. Dovar said, "I'm not familiar with the Compact's jurisdiction in this matter." Master Henwick said, "The Compact has standing under the Tri-Roads Charter to review the terms of registered apprenticeship when a formal complaint of overreach has been filed." He opened his folio. "A complaint was filed 14 months ago by a prior apprentice of yours named Tereth, which the Ford Council declined to act upon. The Compact's review of that complaint was completed last autumn." He looked at Dovar over the top of the folio. "Your apprenticeship registration is currently suspended pending a full hearing. The papers you're carrying have no standing today." The runner with the satchel had taken a small, almost imperceptible step backward. Dovar's composure held. It was a good composure. He had built it over many years against exactly these kinds of eventualities. He said, "I'll need to consult my own counsel before accepting that characterization." Master Henwick said, "That is your right." Physician Oreth said, "And Marin's examination before this Compact 2 weeks from today, regarding the conditions of her apprenticeship, is also her right." She looked at Marin then, not with pity, but with the brisk, confirming look of someone who wants to establish, "You are not alone in this room." Marin stood at the gate in the pale winter light with the cold on her face, and Aldrich at her side. And these two official strangers who had arrived as if summoned from her own need. And she felt something she had not felt in years, which was the sensation of weight distributed across more than one set of shoulders. She said to Physician Oreth, "I will be there." She said it in a voice that was entirely her own. Dovar looked at her for a moment, a longer moment than was comfortable, long enough to be its own kind of message. And then he looked at Aldrich, and then at the Compact officials, and he performed a careful public recalibration. He said, "I see. Well, these things should go through proper channels, naturally." He turned to his runner and said something quiet, and the runner refastened the satchel, and Dovar looked back at Marin once more, and she held his gaze without flinching. And then he turned and walked back down the road toward wherever he had left his horse, and his footsteps receded on the packed snow in the silence of a morning that had gone from ordinary to decisive, and was now, slowly, becoming ordinary again. He did not look back. The narrator notes this as his one unperformed gesture. Whatever Dovar felt in that moment, defeat, calculation about his next approach, something dimmer and less strategic, he kept it entirely to himself, and the not looking back was perhaps the only entirely private thing he had done in the whole encounter. The compact hearing took place 16 days later in the Greyvale Valley Meeting Hall, before a panel of 3 practitioners and 1 civil arbiter. Marin had been preparing for it in the evenings, sitting at Aldrich's work table with the lamp and the old ledger, writing down the record she carried in her body and her memory, dates, incidents, specific words, the names of people who had been present for specific things. The act of writing it was different from the act of remembering it. Memory is experienced in the body, felt as sensation and temperature, and the residue of old fear. Writing is done with a hand that can be steadied, in words that can be chosen, in an order that can be decided. Writing it gave the record a form that she could carry separate from herself, hold at a distance, consider. Sela helped her remember dates. Sela had a memory for dates that was almost uncanny, the product of a child who has learned to track time carefully, because time and its measurement are a form of power in an uncertain household. She would say, "No, it was after the frost market, so that was the 15th, not the 12th, and she was always right." Bryn made Marin a drawing of Stone the cat to take to the hearing. "For luck," he said. She kept it folded in her coat pocket. The hearing itself took most of a day. Physician Orith presented the compact's review findings. Master Henwick read the relevant charter provisions. Marin gave her account plainly, in order, looking at the panel and not at her hands, and the panel asked questions that were precise and unhurried, and she answered each one. The specific mechanism of Dovar's hold was documented carefully. The false extension of a registration that had legally lapsed, his use of community standing to represent himself as her necessary vouching authority, when in fact no such vouchsafe was required under charter law, the conditions of the family's room in his property, the lock. 3 people appeared to give account of what they had witnessed. One was Carith, the prior apprentice, who had filed the original complaint 14 months ago, and who sat with his hands flat on the table and spoke in the deliberate, careful voice of someone who has been carrying a stone for a long time and is finally allowed to set it down. One was a woman from Carath Ford named Pell, who had been their nearest neighbor, and who had watched the family for 4 years with the discomfort of someone who knew something was wrong and had not acted, and had decided that not acting again was no longer tolerable. One was the constable of Carath Ford, who had received 3 prior inquiries about the family's situation and had done very little with them, and who appeared at the hearing voluntarily, without subpoena, which was his way of making a record of his own. Dovar did not appear. He had sent counsel, who read a prepared statement disputing the characterization of the arrangement, and the panel thanked the counsel, and the counsel sat down, and the panel deliberated for 1 hour and 20 minutes, and returned to find that Dovar's apprenticeship registration was revoked permanently, that Marin held no outstanding obligation to him under any valid instrument of the charter, and that the family's residency at any location of her choosing was entirely her own decision to make, and to make freely. The panel chair read the determination in a level, official voice, and when she finished, the hall had a particular quality of quiet that is different from ordinary silence. It is the quiet of something that has been pressing against a boundary for a very long time, finally coming through. Maren sat with it for a moment. Then she folded Bryn's drawing more carefully and returned it to her pocket and stood up, and Physician Orith, passing on her way to the door, stopped and looked at her and said, simply, "You knew your trade well. He was lucky you didn't know your rights as well. Now you know both." She said, "Yes." She rode back to the longhouse in the late afternoon light, which was the particular gold of a winter sun already low, the kind of light that does not linger and so makes each thing it touches look specifically itself, each pine, each fence post, each smoke thread rising from each chimney in the valley below. Aldrich was at the gate when she arrived, which was not a surprise. He had the look of a man who had been doing other things and happened to be near the gate when she arrived, which was the version of waiting that leaves the person being waited for their dignity. He said, "Well," she said, "it's done." He said, "Good." They walked to the house in the last of the afternoon light, and inside Bryn flung himself at her from approximately 4 feet away, with the particular aerial faith of a 4-year-old who has never once been uncaught. And she caught him, and over his shoulder she could see Selah at the table with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper, drawing something, and Stone on the hearth, and the birchwood figure on the mantel standing in its permanent address, the dried flowers gone nearly white. Spring came slowly that year, which was correct for what it needed to accomplish. The snow retreated in stages, leaving the earth dark and wet and new-smelling, and the root cellar work gave way to early garden work, and the physics stores were fully cataloged and beginning to attract the attention of a few valley residents who had heard that someone at Aldrich's longhouse knew her remedies and was willing to see people by arrangement. She saw them at the work table 2 mornings a week, and she charged a fair rate and accepted fair exchange and called it what it was, which was her own work, her own practice, her own name on the arrangement. One evening in early April, Aldrich came in from the yard and sat at the table with the particular purposefulness of a man who has been turning something over for a long time and has decided the turning is complete. He set a small object on the table between them. It was a piece of worked copper, bent into a ring, simple and unadorned, clearly shaped by the same hands that had shaped Selah's bird, careful and imperfect and honest. He said, "I am not asking you to replace anything." He glanced at the mantel, at the birchwood figure. He said, "She was 19 years of my life, and she is staying on that mantel for the rest of mine. What I'm asking is whether there is room, alongside that, for something that is also real." Maren looked at the ring. She looked at the figure on the mantel. She looked at this man, his calloused hands, his plain speech, his total willingness to be exactly what he was and require nothing of her but the same. She said, "Selah will want to approve it formally. I'd recommend going through proper channels." Aldrich said, "I already showed her the ring last week." Maren said, "What did she say?" He said, "She said the copper is uneven." She said, "And?" He said, "She said that's all right. Things don't have to be even to be right." Maren picked up the ring. She turned it in her hands, the way she turned roots and bark and the recovered materials of lost knowledge, carefully seeking its properties, its yield, its honest use. She put it on. The wedding was small, a late April morning, the mud just firming, apple trees behind the house beginning to furl pale green at the tips of their branches. Physician Orith performed the brief. 2 valley neighbors stood witness. Bryn wore a clean shirt and held Stone throughout, who bore this with the philosophical patience the cat had come to apply to most things involving Bryn. Selah stood very straight with her wooden bird in her pocket, and watched the whole proceeding with the grave, evaluative attention she brought to all important things, and at the end gave a single nod of professional endorsement, which was the highest tribute available in Sela's particular register of approval. After, Maran stood at the open door of the longhouse, looking out at the warming yard, the mud paths, the stacked wood, the gate with its amber lantern. Behind her, Bryn was explaining to Stone, in great detail, that they lived here now for always, which Stone appeared to accept as a reasonable development. Aldrich was beside her at the door, not speaking. She began to hum, the tune her mother had taught her, the one she had recovered slowly over the winter, note by note, like recovering a language you were told you didn't need. She hummed it quietly, and then more certainly, and the sound of it in the warming air of the longhouse was new and also very old, both things simultaneously, the way that real things tend to be. On the mantel, the birchwood figure stood in its place. At its feet, Aldrich had set a small, smooth river stone that Bryn had given him the week before, pronouncing it lucky. The dried flowers had not been moved. The stone had simply been placed beside them in the available space, without ceremony and without apology. This is what that stone meant, if it meant anything at all, that the heart does not heal by forgetting what it held before. It heals by growing wide enough to hold what comes after, too. The old roots are still there, still real, still fed by everything they ever reach toward. The new growth rises beside them, not instead of them. This is not replacement. This is a house that has found more than one reason to keep its fire lit. This is the only kind of healing worth the name. The spring morning opened around them, specific and full, smelling of wet earth and new wood and the stockpot warming on the fire inside. Marin hummed her mother's tune. Bryn told Stone about their permanent arrangement. Sela added a new wing to her snow architecture, which was mud architecture now, and arguably more permanent. And Aldrich stood at the door of his longhouse, which had been silent for too long and was not silent anymore, and he listened to all of it, and what was in his face was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was something quieter and more durable. The look of a man who had kept the fire lit through a long cold without knowing exactly why, and had just found out.